Hi, everyone. I am Asma Mahdi, extremely excited to be here with Sean. And we're here tonight to talk about environmental justice, racial justice, and the intersection of those two topics in the environmental movement. I can do a little brief intro, and then Sean, I'll turn it over to you to do the same. So I'm currently a policy director at a environmental consulting firm here in Los Angeles called Better World Group. The firm has roots in downtown LA, but we also have an ear to Sacramento. And I lead our firm's racial justice practice, and most recently led a team who worked on the state of Oregon's climate equity the climate equity blueprint for their climate change adaptation framework. And that came out about a month ago. And prior to joining Better World Group, I got to work a little bit. I don't know if we actually worked directly together, but I worked at UCLA for the Sustainable LA Grand Challenge, and Sean and I connected while we were there. And prior to UCLA, I worked in Washington, D.C. for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and simultaneously got involved in Green Muslims. So Green Muslims is a nonprofit organization that engages the Muslim community on living the environmental spirit of Islam. Sean, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. So I'm Sean Hecht. I am the co-executive director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at UCLA School of Law. I teach environmental law and various other classes at UCLA. Before I was at UCLA, I worked for the California State Attorney General's office in their environment section, litigating environmental law cases. I also serve right now as the chair of the California Lawyers Association's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, which has a mission of diversifying the bar practicing attorneys. And I'm excited to be here. I'm always interested in talking to folks about environmental justice and environmental policy and issues like that. And I'm happy to be here with Asma. I'm also a member of the congregation ICAR here in Los Angeles. My environmental professional work has not connected directly with my Jewish work, and so that's another reason I'm particularly interested to be here today with a group of people who work on interfaith issues. And I guess one other thing, I've also been involved with the organization New Ground, did their professional fellowship program where Jews and Muslims work together to think about and work on various types of interfaith justice initiatives. So happy to be here today.
All right, shall we kick it off, Sean? So we're going to do like a series of interviewing each other and try to make this as dynamic as possible, and want to invite everyone who's on the Zoom webinar to, drop in any questions you have in the chat, and we'll try to answer that. And also you can use the raise your hand feature. I believe that should be, if you look at the bottom part of your screen, or if you're in the participants menu, you should be able to, it should say raise your hand in there, and you should be able to click on that button, and then we'll see you pop up in the queue.
It may be on the reactions menu with some people's versions of Zoom also. I think it varies.
Right. And then we can invite you to ask your question that way as well. Great. So to kick us off, Sean, I want to ask you, what does environmental justice mean to you? And how is it different from environmentalism?
Yeah, so I came to environmental law through thinking of myself as somebody interested in preserving the environment. And, when I was younger, I thought of it mostly as thinking about the natural environment, because that's I enjoy being outdoors. I see Asma's background as a good example of a kind of place that environmentalists have worked to preserve. And one of the things I began to see over time was that environmental policy, environmentalism is just as much about the public health of people as it is about flowers and trees and preserving open spaces. And many of our landmark environmental laws like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act are really aimed at making sure that people have better, safer places to live, and the Clean Air Act in particular, and our various laws relating to hazardous waste are along those lines as well. And so when you start thinking about the environment as where we all live, whether it's an urban environment or out in nature or whatever, you start seeing that our environmental laws are really designed to improve public health. And yet, since really the 1970s, early 1980s, it's become apparent that the progress that we make on environmental issues is not progress for everyone. And so I grew up here in Southern California, on the west side of Los Angeles, and the air quality is so much better right now than it was when I was growing up in the 1970s. You can measure it, you can feel it in your lungs. It's a very, very different feeling place. At the same time, there are people who live in the community of Wilmington near the Port of Los Angeles who live literally across the fence from an oil refinery, or who live within a couple hundred feet of the 110 or 710 freeway with all the trucks that move goods from the port of Los Angeles to other places. Or there are literally people who have oil wells in and around their backyards in that part of Los Angeles. We also have big chunks of the city where historical industry has polluted really wide swaths of the city. And we can talk more about that later if people want to hear more specific examples. And so what environmental justice is, I mean, I guess I'll define environmental injustice, which is the disproportionate environmental harm that comes to some communities based on either their economic status. It's pretty clear to everyone that if you have less wealth, you're going to live in an environment that is less clean and has more pollution in it and more harms that come to people from environmental factors, and also by race. And there's quite a bit of research that shows that environmental health is correlated both with race and with poverty. And so environmental justice is really the movement and the practice of trying to overcome that and trying to change that. And in a way, the environmental justice movement is very much part of the overall environmental movement. I mean, we have the same goals in a sense, in a very important sense, but it's also true that environmental justice activists and advocates, people who live in these communities, often feel like and believe for good reason that they've been left behind by the very environmental advocates that are advocating for clean air and clean water. And in part because the progress we've made has left a lot of these communities behind. And so in the last couple of decades, we've seen a lot of change and a lot of movement towards thinking about environmental advocacy as incorporating environmental justice, but we're still very much not quite there yet. So that's just a start in thinking about environmental justice, and it's just my perspective. I mean, I think one of the important things about thinking about environmental justice is that it's important to understand what communities are experiencing from their own perspective. And so I'm always very conscious that I'm adjacent to environmental justice. I work with environmental justice advocates in my own work, but I don't understand what they experience the way that they do within their own communities. And so, take my perspective as that of somebody who's really from the outside looking in. So Asma, I'm going to turn to you now. And so we also want to talk about racial justice specifically. And so I want to turn to you to think about how racial justice specifically means, what that means to you and how that connects with environmental justice as you understand it. And feel free also to weigh in on environmental justice and correct anything I said or add to it.
I think the words environmental justice and racial justice and equity are, everyone comes at it with their, especially if it's your lived experience, a certain perspective. And with racial justice, I think similarly, I want to start off with maybe a little bit of an origin story when it comes to how I got into the environmental movement. the ocean. I mean, I also lived and grew up in Los Angeles, and not too close to the ocean. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, but my parents would take my brother and I often to, the coast, be that Santa Monica, be that Malibu. We have family in Long Beach and San Pedro, and felt very at one with the ocean and thought, this is what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be a marine biologist. So went to undergrad at UCLA, and growing up in Los Angeles and then going to UCLA, I lived in a bubble of diversity, and I lived in a bubble of where a lot of people, I knew people from a lot of different backgrounds. Um, and then after UCLA, took some time off to work and then start grad school. And I think that's where the racial justice, my like formative experience, really began in graduate school. Not so much because we were taught about racial justice, but because I went to UC Santa Barbara and I went to their environmental program. And out of a cohort of 90 students, only 11 of us were students of color. And of those 11, five students were international students. So it was a very jolting experience personally that I had. I guess it prepared me for what the real world environmental movement did actually look like. And so in a way, it was both jarring, but also formative, as I like to think about it. Went to Washington, D.C., experienced the same at the federal level. I feel like that's changing a little bit now. But, I think what that really highlighted for me was the importance of different stories, the importance of different narratives, and bringing that into the environmental movement was so critical. And also faith communities and bringing in faith community voices. I think for so long, the environment and the faith have, or science and faith can sometimes be at odds. And I think the environmental science, environmental movement is a really wonderful, beautiful place for religions to come together and work on interfaith work, and bring that aspect together. And there's so much wonderful diversity in that. So to me, racial justice is that the universal we recognize that there have been past wrongdoings, and how are we taking those wrongdoings? So for example, I'm actually trying to hold my grad school accountable now. How do you take those past wrongdoings and then pair that with deliberative, proactive reparations? And so to make it relevant to the environmental movement, I think about, you were starting to touch on this, Sean. How do we look at digging into those structures, those policies and processes, at the local, state, at the federal level, within our own communities, within our own structures, our own institutions, and how are we righting those wrongs? People also talk about racial justice, and then they talk about equity. I like to think of them as related, but a little separate. To me, equity, I see it as, I really see it as how are we resourcing and investing and considering the limitations different people may have, in order for in order to have an environmental justice outcome, or a just outcome, so that way everyone can thrive at the same level. So it means recognizing that some communities might actually, that have faced historic disinvestments, need more resources, they need more funding, need more money to get them to be where places that have been thriving and are affluent are already at. So that's how I see the two of them. So I guess maybe jumping in on that a little bit, Sean, I'm curious, how have our laws and our regulations addressed environmental injustices? And how have they contributed to it? So we were just talking about, the race piece, like how has that contributed to injustices? And are there current laws, both locally in California or federally, that are helping to solve that?
Yeah, thanks. So I think I'll start with the bad news, which is that we actually have very, very few laws at the local, state, or federal level among all the myriad environmental regulations that we have very few laws that specifically address, or really almost no laws that specifically address disproportionate impacts of environmental problems on poor communities or communities of color. Our environmental laws aren't written that way. The Clean Air Act, for example, so there was a wave of federal environmental laws that were passed from about 1969 through the early 70s. And among those were the Clean Air Act, and I'll focus on that one for a minute. The Clean Air Act, the whole idea behind the Clean Air Act is that we would set a standard where nobody should have to breathe air that has more pollution than the standard. And so the idea was that everywhere in the country would have to attain the standards for pollution. And that's a great aspiration. It's a very important one, and it's one that has resulted in cleaning up the air in a lot of places. But one thing to keep in mind is that the way that that's measured is it's measured with a bunch of monitors that are designed to try to measure the air quality throughout the region. And so Southern California, most of the Los Angeles and San Bernardino, Riverside County area is in a single air basin that's determined to be in or out of attainment with these standards. And for many years, there were half a dozen or maybe a dozen monitors in places to measure representatively how clean is the air here. And the number of monitors has gone up, and unsurprisingly, the air is worse in Riverside than it is in Santa Monica most of the time. But what these monitors don't measure is what happens at every single intersection and neighborhood. And so because a lot of pollution is more localized, and we've learned that in the ensuing decades, that law does not result in the air being clean, again, for absolutely everybody. It's in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s and beyond, there's been an increasing body of research that, for example, has caused public health authorities to say it's a bad idea to put housing within 500 feet of a freeway. It's a bad idea to have people living near oil production and oil exploration. It's a bad idea to have people living very close to various types of industrial facilities. But in 1970, that wasn't what was on the minds of the Congress people who wrote the Clean Air Act. They weren't thinking about what happens to someone across the street from an oil refinery. They were kind of thinking about Los Angeles as just one big basin that has a lot of air, and we want that air to be less polluted. And so the result of that has been that we don't even measure the air quality at the fence line of oil refineries. We rarely measure the air quality 100 feet or 500 feet from a freeway. And so the result of that has been, and there's no law that requires that, that the air quality be better in those places specifically. And so the result of that set of laws has meant that environmental justice has not been a thing that our laws have really addressed particularly well. There's even cases where you could even say that our environmental laws have exacerbated environmental justice issues. I mean, when you think about it, our planning and zoning laws that result in very, very clean and beautiful places are related to the fact that our factories, our heavy industry, our landfills are located in other places that are not those places. And so, you wouldn't expect there to be a landfill in Beverly Hills, and yet there is a landfill right next to the community of Sun Valley, which is also a residential community. You wouldn't expect to see wealthy people living next to a former chrome plating facility, and yet there are people in poorer communities who live next to former chrome plating facilities where the soil and the groundwater around it might be polluted. And so our historical pattern of land use that, laws that actually in many ways were meant to solve problems by creating an orderly pattern of where people live and keeping industry separate from residences might have exacerbated the problem. And even something like recycling, for example, we collect a lot of waste plastic, and that waste plastic gets exported to other countries. where we don't often know about exactly what the consequence is. And in fact, China, for a bunch of reasons, some of which were certainly not environmental reasons, but some of which were, a few years ago, stopped taking waste from the United States. We have something similar with car battery recycling, where the lead acid batteries that's in everybody's car were creating a huge problem. We don't want to have to mine new lead, which causes terrible types of environmental impacts. And so we reprocess lead from old batteries. But it turns out every place where car batteries are reprocessed through new smelting of the lead, it turns out that the communities right next to them really get hit hard. And so those are just some examples of the ways that our laws have been inadequate and in some cases even counterproductive to ensuring environmental justice.
And we have a question. We have a question in the chat that says, can you share the statistics of environmental and racial justice?
So I don't have statistics at hand. I mean, I guess I can say a few things. So there have been some studies done. There have been a couple of organizations that have looked at more what Usma was talking about, the composition of the environmental movement, and have concluded, statistically and just through counting up the numbers, that the people of color are poorly represented at most environmental organizations. There are very few of them on boards of directors. There are very few people of color in senior leadership positions. I mean, it's very well documented that the representation isn't there. And I do think representation is quite important, because the issues that people care about, if they're from a community and if they're connected to a particular community, are going to drive the priorities of the advocates that are there. And so I think that is very well documented. There is a very long history, since I'd say at least the 1980s, of scholars documenting environmental injustice directly by trying to use statistical analysis, trying to underpin, what the patterns are. And it's very, very clear that if you are poor, or if you're a person of color, regardless of your income, you are more likely to be exposed to environmental stressors. California actually has a web-based tool called EnviroScreen, and the EnviroScreen tool allows you to look at a map and to look at a database by zip code, and it includes both some demographic factors. It doesn't include race as a factor, but it includes demographic factors that are social determinants of health, along with different environmental harms, and they give a score to each census tract in the state. And I'll see if I can find it and put it up on the screen at some point, because I think it'll be a useful thing for people to see. But it's very clearly documented what the correlation is. Now, there's debate about what that correlation means, like what it's attributable to. There are arguments that it's a natural result of the way that property value tracks environmental quality. But there are also people who've pointed out that historical practices like racial redlining and other practices that have put certain groups or excluded certain groups from certain parts of the city have had the consequence of concentrating communities of color in areas where there are more environmental harms. I'm going to see if I can find, the EnviroScreen. I don't know, Asma, if you want to add anything to what I was
I think
saying.
while you're looking for EnviroScreen, which I think is a really great tool, the other thing to think about, environmental justice is such a broad term. And so it's always helpful for me to think about, like, Sean, as you were relaying too, this could be air quality. So I think a lot about farmers in the Central Valley has some of the poorest air quality in the state of California. And a lot of that is due to both farming practices. A lot of that is also due to just the geography of the region. And then there's a lot of transportation. So there's all these like layering issues that contribute to the pollution in that region. And then we think about, who are the people that are doing the farm, like a lot of this is a lot about the farm workers. And there are a lot of farm workers in the Central Valley. that are people of color. And so how is that health being protected? So I tend to think about the health outcomes of individuals when I think about environmental justice, but also, is it air quality? Is it, access to the outdoors? Um, and, or is it in some cases like how close do you live to a freeway? How close do you live to an oil derrick? So so many things can contribute to an environmental injustice.
Yes, absolutely. So here's the Kellen virus screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a map of Los Angeles by census tract, and the red is more exposure to pollution and correlated together with more negative social determinants of health. And I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone. I don't think I even need to say much about this map for you to understand what this illustrates. If you look at at various communities, if you compare the West Side and the foothills and Beverly Hills and Rancho Palos Verdes to East LA, Boyle Heights, downtown LA, South Central LA, Inglewood, Compton, going down towards the Port of Los Angeles into Carson and West Long Beach. I think it's a pretty stark illustration. And of course, the data that goes into this isn't perfect. They're using proxies for all kinds of different things. They're trying to do the best that they can, but there are a lot of variables, and no matter what variables you use, you end up with relatively similar results, if you look at communities relative to each other. Going into this are variables that include everything from the number of toxic waste sites in the area. Can you see the pop-up that just appeared on my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so this pop-up gives you, so this is a census tract right here that is, it's in South Central LA. Hold on, let me see. I'm not doing what I had hoped to do there. Let me try again. Okay, so this is a census tract in South Central LA, and this census tract, the percentile is 90 to 95th percent, which means that 90 to 95% of all communities in California are less polluted or have a lower score than this community. It has high characteristics on both pollution burden and population characteristics. And so this just goes through the different variables that are used here. And you can see all the different variables that are, that are impaired. And then these here, asthma and low birth weight and cardiovascular health and education level and linguistic isolation and poverty, unemployment and housing burden are also correlated together with that. And so you can see as you look through, you can click on any particular census tract and you'd find, you could find this information. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put in the chat a link to this so people can explore this themselves. Yeah, I think that, these are important questions, and there's a lot of research yet to be done. It's not perfectly correlated with race or with poverty, these outcomes, and there's a lot of different variables, a lot of things people haven't fully understood, and researchers are working on that. So we have another question. We have two other questions in the chat. Vegetation and its effect on air quality. Do you want to talk about that, Asma? You probably have a better perspective on that than I do, with more of a science background than I have.
So the question is, does the presence of trees and other vegetation have significant effect on air quality? Yes and no. So, in Southern California, we are in what's called a chaparral environment, and trees are important. Trees are important for cleaning our air. A lot of our oxygen also comes from the ocean. So, a lot of what we breathe is also thanks to what I like to call Big Blue that's in our backyard. And trees are helpful. And I know there are many efforts across I think even the state of California, I hear locally to plant as many trees as possible. And both that, although that's, well intended, the types of trees you plant are really important, especially down here in Southern California. We live in what's called a fire adaptive ecology. So chaparral is a type of ecology that when it burns, when you burn chaparral, bushes or plants, they often propagate or release their seeds into the soil once they're heated up enough. So fire has been part of the state of California and this region's ecology. So fire is actually something that's good for the environment. But what we saw over the last several years are these massive wildfire events. And a lot of that has to do with our own maintenance of land and not being able to ironically maintain and maintain shrubs and take out what we call excess vegetation. So there can be, in certain areas vegetation is great. You need a lot more vegetation in damper areas like rainforests. That's where vegetation really thrives. In places like California, being mindful of what we plant and what we grow in the region, it really tells us about, how we're interacting with the environment. And what we've seen over the past several years and what we witnessed last year was um, a departure from what used to be indigenous practices, especially in the Sierra Nevadas up in Northern California, of cultural burning and prescribed fire, which was part of many of the Karuk and the Yurok tribe up in Northern California. As part of their cultural tradition, they used to, do prescribed burns. And if you think about burning, the thought, as we were just talking about, like, it leads to bad air quality and all these other effects. Burning, small amounts of burning done intentionally and, at the right time of year can actually be helpful and better than a large megafire event. So planting of trees are good. It's not that it's a bad thing. I think it's thinking about, what trees are important and indigenous and native to, where we live, that I think that's really the key.
Yeah, and I'll add just a couple more things. So, depending on how broadly or narrowly you want to think about environmental justice, you can also think about other aspects of our environment that are not like waste and air pollution. So, for example, you can think about the way about heat impacts on people, which will be exacerbated with climate change. That's an example of something where it is documented that for a bunch of different reasons, on average, people of color live in communities that are more likely to be affected by extreme heat. And that actually is affected by urban vegetation to a large extent, to a greater extent than, people are learning more and more the extent to which that is true. And so, you can see it even, in communities in the inland part of Los Angeles, stretching from downtown to the Inland Empire. The communities that have more open space and more trees and more greenery are areas that are typically going to be less hot on a day-to-day basis for people who live there. And so, that also makes a difference. And we see the same kind of disparities in that situation as well. It's not air quality specifically, but it does matter. So the next question I see in the chat, I have a couple other things I'm sure we're going to want to talk about, but I'd love to answer people's questions or talk about people's questions anyway. Why are people of color and poor people not well represented in environmental movements as activists? So that's a tough question. I think part of it is the history of the environmental movement. It grew out of a set of movements that was mostly originally people who recreationally went out into nature, and it tended to be groups of white people who did that founded the big environmental organizations like Sierra Club, for example. It was founded around those kinds of ideas and practices. And I think, I mean, part of the story, though, is just every large institutional movement, was whiter in previous generations than they are becoming now. And so I think it's a combination of all of those. I'll put up another link in the chat. This is an organization called Green 2.0 or Diverse Green. And this is an organization that was founded a few years ago to study these questions and to try to address these questions. And I don't know. I mean, every organization has its own history, and you see complicated histories for each of the major environmental organizations. But I think in general, it was, this set of issues as a set of activist issues were seen as the domain of white activists for many, many years. And it really wasn't until the 1980s that started to be challenged, with starting with the work of a man named Robert Bullard, followed up by a number of other advocates who started pointing out both the environmental justice issues and the lack of representation. And I think it makes sense also that when you don't have the representation, you don't focus on the issues that are as important to the communities that aren't well represented. And so I think we ended up then in a situation where the issues tended to be the issues that the people who were leaders in the movement cared about. And so by changing, and making and diversifying the leadership in the environmental movement, we're starting to get more focus on environmental justice issues. And so and one example would be Earth Justice, which was founded as the Sierra Club Legal Defense Fund. It was the lawyers who worked for and with the Sierra Club. It's a really great organization that won amazing court victories in the 1970s. And at a certain point, they rebranded themselves to call themselves Earth Justice, and they diversified the types of work that they were working on. To the point where today Earth Justice has an entire team of attorneys in their Healthy Communities program who are devoted to environmental justice work, working for grassroots clients. So this is another aspect of it, is when you have a centralized movement, you're less likely to take into account the concerns of every particular local group. And environmental justice tends to be a really local thing because people's concerns are right there in their backyard. And so Earth Justice now has many environmental justice clients. It has teams of lawyers who are working on behalf of communities here in Los Angeles, specifically focused on toxics and air quality and issues like that in Latino and Black communities here in the Los Angeles area. That was not true even 10 years ago, and certainly wasn't true 30 years ago. And we see that illustrated, pretty starkly by the journey that organization has been taking.
And then we have one more question in the chat here that says, what trees are best to plant? I don't know quite how to answer that, but I do know that there's two organizations I can think of, and Sean, if you have thoughts on this too. So one is Tree People, which is actually right by UCLA. So Tree People, I can put this in, treepeople.org. They do work, I think you can sign up to do a tree planting with Tree People. At least you could many years ago when I was in an undergrad. And then another one is California Native Plant Society. And there you go.
I anticipated what you were going to say there.
Yeah, so California Native Plant Society, they have a really great understanding and eye on like what is native to the state of California. And succulents, I think, are part of the chaparral makeup down here. We are desert in California as well. So if you go onto CMPS's website, which Sean put in the link there, there might be some ideas that you can generate.
Yeah, Tree People is another example of an organization that has had a journey towards environmental justice. I'll put a link. If you had looked at Tree People's programs and website 15 or 20 years ago, they were a great organization doing amazing work, but they were very different. They were not self-consciously thinking about how does urban heat disproportionately affect different people in our community 20 years ago. And now that is what they're thinking about. They're not thinking how can we plant more trees in Santa Monica or in Beverly Hills but they're thinking about how can we help communities that really need it the most. Um, so I also have a question that I think was a private message to me. I don't know if it was intended for both of us about whether nuclear power plants are clean energy or not. I don't know if we can even, it's a little bit far afield. I think there's a lot of debate in the environmental community about the role of nuclear power. I mean, people who are focused on climate change as an existential threat beyond all other threats, I think many people who view the problem that way understand nuclear energy potentially to be a necessary part of the energy mix if we are going to get off of fossil fuels, because it is a carbon-free energy source. There are also many people in the environmental community who are still very much opposed to nuclear energy because of the lack of any sort of clarity or certainty about what happens to nuclear waste in our society. I'm not going to take it on. I actually am very agnostic about that question. I think it's a very tough question. I mean, 15 years ago, I would have told you I was anti-nuclear power, period. But as climate change becomes a more, such a serious threat, and the imperative to get off of fossil fuels complicates that, I think.
And I'll add, there is an organization, I don't know if that some people might be aware of, called Interfaith Power and Light. They do a lot of organizing. They are headquartered in California. They have an arm in DC, and do a lot of organizing around renewable energy. So I can see if I can look up that link and drop it in. They're definitely looking into and do really great organizing with faith communities.
I mean, one of the things that we're also learning, and I guess, again, this is probably pretty obvious when you think about it, is that the impacts of harms like climate change are going to be felt the most by poorer communities, both globally and also within our own communities, and are also felt within our own communities most heavily in communities of color in a fairly systematic way as well. And so, environmental justice has started to encompass a lot of different kinds of thinking. As we think about how we address climate change, are we thinking specifically about how those effects are going to be disproportionate? The climate, whatever happens to the climate in the next 20 or 30 years, I personally am likely to be pretty okay, but there are many people whose vulnerability is much higher. And so local governments do vulnerability assessments, where part of what they're trying to do is to assess not just the physical impacts of climate change, but the social vulnerability. And that insight, I think, then becomes an important component as you think about environmental justice. I think there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it. I mean, some people would say environmental justice really includes everything in the built environment, down to, just about every decision that government makes. At a certain point, that kind of merges, I think, with racial justice, as you think about it that way, or economic justice. I think there are other people who would see environmental justice as being, intentionally a narrower thing in order to make sure that people, have their eye on the idea that some problems might be uniquely thought of as environmental or public health related problems.
That makes me think about one thing, Sean, about, something that we are going to be facing and that we're facing right now is there's a lot of migration happening across the world. And climate migration and climate refugees are going to be more and more, there's just going to be more. We're seeing that already with, what's happening in Bangladesh. You see what's happening in areas across the Middle East. You see what's happening even here in the United States, like after Hurricane Katrina, that we have a lot of the climate impacts on people and what that means in terms of displacement and what will happen and the status of those people. So as we're thinking about climate and we're thinking about the environment, we also simultaneously, and this is why, having such a myopic lens on climate is in effect harmful, and you have to think a little broader than that. And like, the immigration policies we have now and the immigration reform that we're thinking about now, it's going to impact refugees. It's also going to impact climate refugees and how we classify climate refugees. And is there going to be a distinction? Is everyone the same? So starting to think about how everything is sort of connected is going to be really important. And I think that's why the term environmental justice can be both both broad and both narrow, depending on how you're looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. So there's a question and comment in the chat about the Exide battery recycling plant. I'm always happy to talk about the Exide plant. I've been working on and off on issues relating to the Exide plant for more than 15 years now. That plant is a really good example of how things can go terribly wrong. What's interesting about that, so that industry existed long, long before we had any environmental laws, because lead's a valuable commodity. And so when people have waste lead, they needed a place to re-smelt that lead into something new. And most of the boats and ships that are out there in the ocean have keels that have lead in them because it's a stable, heavy metal that enables boats to be stable in the water. We have lead acid batteries. We have all kinds of different uses for lead. And really, since at least I think the 1920s or 1930s, we've had a secondary lead smelting business in Southern California. There used to be several of these plants, and there were no laws that governed what they did. And so one interesting thing about, and sad thing about a situation like the Exide battery plant, where this one facility located in the city of Vernon is responsible for a huge amount of lead contamination throughout central and southeast LA County. And so one of the
I'm scared you're gonna fall.
Sorry, I'm getting distracted by by ambient noise a little bit. Thank you. So they operated, but they operated completely lawfully. And one of the interesting things about it and sad things about it is that there's nothing we can do retrospectively about that contamination except figure out how to clean it up, which is hundreds of millions of dollars and a lot of time and effort to try to deal with that. And then, at the moment, the state allocated over $100 million for the cleanup of residential properties near the Exide plant, but they're just looking at properties within a certain perimeter. And if you go like a couple blocks outside that perimeter, there are still properties that were harmed by it. And so, and then you multiply that by all the other plants that, that have come and gone, and you start looking and you find it everywhere. So in Watts, the Jordan Downs public housing complex has lead in the soil. That's the legacy of secondary lead smelting. There's a lot of this there, and there's nothing we can do except clean it up. And the challenge then, and on top of that, Exide also was a bad actor in the sense that it operated outside the law. It violated the laws, that it was supposed to follow. But I think it's important to keep in mind that even if it had followed those laws, we still would be in the situation that we're in now. And as the comment says, as Chris says in the comment, Exide is now in bankruptcy, and it's not going to be responsible, and it's not responsible in part because there's no money there left. I mean, they've paid what they paid, and the company's not staying in business any longer, and so there's no pot of money. Some of the tools that can be used going forward include what's called financial assurance, which means that when you permit a facility, you require them to put aside an amount of money or to have an insurance policy or some other mechanism which guarantees that when they close, there will be enough money available to clean it up. I can't even imagine how somebody could have done enough financial assurance to do, to make a facility like Exide profitable. But really, it comes back to what we consume. I mean, because these are all products and services that benefit all of us and then concentrate the harms on particular communities. And, our society is largely built on that. So I don't know. I mean, I could say a lot more about Exide. It's a very difficult and sad situation. On the other hand, it also gives me some hope. I mean, the Exide facility was closed because of public attention. There was an LA Times reporter, Tony Barboza, who did a series of articles in maybe 2013, 2014, that really changed the public conversation about the facility and put pressure on government agencies and ended up getting the facility closed and money allocated for the cleanup. The community organizing made a lot of difference. And so I do see some hope that communities can organize and get media attention that actually does make a difference. So again, I could say a lot more about Exide, but I think it's it's emblematic of a whole set of problems. There's still one remaining secondary lead smelter in the Western United States, and it's also in the Los Angeles area. It's called Quemetco. It's in the City of Industry, I believe, and it's likely to leave a similar legacy to Exide. But it's also true that every one of our cars, and not our electric cars, our Teslas and our Chevy Bolts, but just our regular old cars have their regular old 12-volt car battery that has lead in it, and those go somewhere. And if Quemetco's closed, they're going to go somewhere else, not in our community, but somewhere. So it's a larger problem than that. I don't know, Asma, if you have anything to add about that. There's
You're the Exide expert. I mean, I think, I just think in terms of like, externalities and pollution, that it's just how hard that those communities get hit. I think also about, similarly, I think there's one incinerator that's left in Long Beach that does a lot of incineration, like waste. It's a waste incinerator. And I know a lot of activists, and I know activists that Sean's, I think, has worked with, East Yards Communities for Environmental Justice, are doing a lot to try to shut down this incinerator that where they are burning a lot of, they're burning waste. It's one of the, I think it might be one of the last legacy incinerators in Los Angeles County. And it's really impacted the community that's already, burdened out there with very poor air quality. So yeah, so it's many things happening in the backyard of Los Angeles. Let's see.
Yeah. So I'm looking at some of the other questions. So there's a question about prison for people, who caused these problems. I mean, the thing about the criminal justice system, the criminal justice system isn't built to solve. It's not really built to solve any problems, in my opinion. But it's not built to solve these kinds of problems. Putting some, I'm not saying that that people might not deserve to be imprisoned for intentionally harming people through pollution, but that doesn't get funding or resources to actually clean up the sites. It doesn't change the way the sites are managed. It's of limited value, unfortunately. Now that we have these harms, we have to find ways of cleaning them up. And there's a question about the Superfund program. So the Superfund was originally designed as a way, there was a fee that polluters would pay in, and then the idea was that would be able to pay money to clean up orphan sites where the owners and operators had gone bankrupt or abandoned the sites. The Superfund program has not been funded with that money since probably the mid-1990s. Congress stopped appropriating money for it. And now the way money is gotten is by trying to find the responsible parties and filing lawsuits against them. And that sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, depending on the financial status of those companies and their insurance companies. Before I forget, we are actually hosting a series of panels at my place of employment over the next few weeks. So I'm going to just put a link in the chat if any of those interest you. They're all free, and you can register online if you're interested. I think it's a really interesting set of panels. I'm moderating the one this coming Friday, which is about air pollution with a focus on Los Angeles. And it does include Mark Lopez, who is who's one of the directors of East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice. I find it really inspiring to hear from activists who are working on these cases. It's much more inspiring than hearing from me, I think. People organize youth in their communities. They really make a difference, and it's very empowering, I think, to communities. I was just talking. Part of my work as a law faculty member director and running our environmental law program at UCLA, is mentoring and recruiting not only law students, but people who aren't yet law students. And I was just, I've been in touch for the last couple of months with a bunch of environmental justice activists who became youth activists. They graduated from college and are doing various types of work and are interested in going to law school to do environmental justice work. And it's exciting to me to see that people have that interest. So, I actually have quite a bit of hope when I see that. And these are all folks who are from South LA, Southeast LA, Huntington Park, Wilmington, communities that are really heavily affected by these kinds of issues.
Sean, I know we have about maybe a minute or so left. And maybe as a closing question for both of us, and I'll toss this one to you first. We've talked about environmental justice. We've talked a little bit about racial justice. How can people get involved and get to know some of these organizations and activists that are working on these issues? And do you have suggestions for any?
Yeah, I mean, so most of these organizations, I mean, they're made up mostly of community members, but they are all often interested in help from the outside. They do organizing of various kinds. Like one example would be the campaign to try to stop the expansion. It hasn't succeeded, at least up until now, of the Tesoro oil refinery in Wilmington. They really did bring in a lot of folks from all over the city to do advocacy related to that, not just the people living next to it. So there's a bunch of organizations. So East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice is a good example of one. They also do what they call toxic tours. And the idea is that you get shown by residents and by organizers about some of the things that are going on in their communities. They're really interesting and informative. You just get to see stuff you wouldn't see. I mean, it's kind of it's an odd idea, the tour of toxic sites, but it was the way that I started learning years ago about some of these issues. East Yard at least used to do bicycle toxic tours too, where they would bike through the southeast stretch of the LA River and look at different facilities. There's also an organization called Communities for a Better Environment that's been doing a lot of these this type of organizing, and they also do toxic tours and other kinds of programming. So connecting with those kinds of organizations, I think, can be really valuable. I would just put in the chat these two organizations. And there are also many other kinds of organizations. Someone asked about Climate Strike LA. I think they are still active. There's organizations called Extinction Rebellion. There's a bunch of those types of organizations. But what I will say is that the organizations that are focused heavily on climate change as an issue are not necessarily the same organizations that are focused on environmental justice. They're related. I mean, if you stop, if we stop using oil, we stop the pollution from the oil refineries, and we help our climate change outcomes. But they really are somewhat different focuses. And in fact, environmental justice communities get frustrated in some cases that so much of the focus is on global climate change, which they don't deny the importance of, but they also say, well, how about the air pollution that's been fixed in Santa Monica and Beverly Hills and Redondo Beach, and that hasn't been fixed in our community? And why can't we get to that before, or at the same time as we address climate change?
And I think also, thinking about equity and access, someone asked earlier about, why isn't the environmental movement more diverse? Just thinking about equity and access to some of our public lands and our outdoor spaces. And Los Angeles is a very park poor community and a very park poor county. I think it might be the most park poor county in California. So thinking about equity and access, and so there are groups, in Los Angeles, such as Active San Gabriel Valley, that does a lot of organizing, a lot of work with public lands and park access issues, including, I'm forgetting the name of the program now, but they do something like Rivers to Trails. I think from the LA River up to the trails, like in the San Gabriels. There's also Asian Pacific Islander Forward Movement, so API Forward Movement, that does a lot of work in Chinatown and around Chinatown, Little Tokyo, Asian American communities on environmental issues. And here in the San Fernando Valley, we have Pacoima Beautiful that similarly works on a lot of environmental justice issues. as in both in the San Fernando Valley, but I'm gonna maybe pivot to this question that came about. Also, they've done a lot of work on plastics as well. And I think I'll read this question real quick. So we've been searching for the last 2 years for a recycling center that will take plastic grocery packaging before Caltech closed up its recycling yard. I think the plastics issue is really tough right now. And I know there's legislation at the state level um, to try to fix some of this, or not fix it, but to try to really get at, how do we create either a circular economy around plastics, which failed in the legislature last year. Um, and one of the critiques of that legislation was that it didn't really think about the environmental justice impacts and how this will affect environmental justice communities. So really, there's a push at the county level. So the county released its the LA County Sustainability Plan a couple years ago. And one of the priorities in that plan for Los Angeles is to pivot away from plastics over a period of time. So I think that there are efforts going on right now, but specifically in terms of a recycling center, I'm not quite sure what that would look like right now.
Yeah, and I just dropped in the chat another response to that same thing. I mean, the problem is the volume of plastics we produce and the diversity of the plastics waste stream mean that there just is not, I mean, most of it actually isn't recyclable. We all want it to be recyclable because we use them and we feel bad about throwing them away. But unlike some other materials, some of it is wishful thinking at this point. And there have been several decades of research on plastics recycling. There are some plastic waste streams that are recyclable, but there's so much that we use that just isn't. And the way we get past that, I think, is hopefully, I do think extended producer responsibility, which will motivate producers to think twice before doing plastic packaging, will help us. I mean, the point of that is not for producers to recycle their plastics, really. The point of it is that if they're forced to reckon with it, that they will use less of it. And I think that really is the goal, rather than trying to recycle it in the long run.
And I'll add to that, as especially California looks to electrify transportation, the native material, the origin of plastics is oil. So we are seeing, and we are concerned about very much the pivot of the oil industry from from extraction for transportation to looking at extraction for plastic. So the plastics lobby, similar to the oil lobby, very, very difficult to go up against. And so it's going to take an entire movement, which is why it's exciting to see, a younger generation get engaged. And, you have people like, Climate Strike and Sunrise Movement really galvanize and get activated around how do you push back against oil? Because so much of this is part of that. Like they're kind of the origin to many of our issues.
Yeah. And just one last thing, I guess I'll say, I really appreciate all of the comments in the chat. You're referencing other organizations. There's a lot of organizations doing really great work. I do think it's important, again, just to keep in mind that the organizations that focus on environmental justice are a little bit different, because they tend to be really community focused and made up of people from the communities that are most affected. And so, there's a lot of ways to be an environmental advocate. And some of those ways are focused more on, there's a diversity of different kinds of ways that environmental advocacy happens. But these environmental justice groups are very place-based. They're very much about, we're from this community, we're trying to advocate to make sure that the harms don't come to our community. And I think that can be very complementary with climate change lobbying and other types of, planning reform and things like that. But they're not quite the same thing, even though they will work together. And so it's interesting to see those kinds of, and I think more and more we're seeing coalitions and coalescences of interest between those organizations, which is something that makes me really optimistic. So Carol, I think we're at our time, maybe over our time. So I want to throw it back to you. Sorry about that.
I usually add a few minutes, but I want to thank both Asma and Sean. This has been great. My husband's back there talking, probably here. I might got to put him on mute, but he agreed. A lot of really interesting information. Has been recorded, and the recording will be sent out. And also we will have notes from the meeting. And in those, we'll include the different websites or the different URLs that you gave us and the different organizations. But we thank you. Just want to mention here, let's see, let me share my screen.
You wrote down when you sent it. Sure.
Yeah, I
I'm being disruptive.
just want to share this. To let you know, the next meeting is May 16th, 5 to 6 p.m. And the topic will be women, the role of women in religion. And also on the screen there, hopefully you could see it, is my email address, carol.interfaithstudygroup@gmail.com if you want to get onto our mailing list. So I don't know if that was actually shared or not. Was that shared? So, well,
You lose.
wait a minute. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing. So again, thank you, everybody. I know that Ramadan starts tomorrow night. Have a good Ramadan for everybody who is celebrating that. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Cool.
Thank you, Carol. Thanks, everybody.
Do it in a few minutes, maybe. Let me see. Do you want to stop the cloud? Yes.